Yeah, so apparently the lesson of that is ask me a question, and I will answer you in 8 years. That's generally the timeline that I work on.
Hold it. I forgot one thing. So sorry. It was his birthday yesterday, so we're all going to sing happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Stephen. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Wow, you guys are so nice. We did say no gifts, but if you have anything, you can bring them up. I feel really bad because this is now the fourth event that I've had to go to in the last 2 days, and I've wanted to be in this room this whole time, and I haven't been able to. So I've been kind of desperately following along on Twitter and through the blogs and keeping up as best I can, and I'm going to go back and watch it all. But in following it from afar, I saw a couple of things. Obviously, I heard about the amazing response to Jim's talk, which sounds just amazing. I also saw Scott from Meetup tweeted at a certain point that he wanted people on stage to talk not just about the kind of the details of what they've done, but the broader theory of change that they have. And whatever Scott says, tells me to do, I do. That's generally a general rule of my life. And so that's what I'm going to try and do today in this short amount of time. Talk about some of these new ideas that I'm working on that are actually going to be in this new book. So it's a lot of new material here. And in some sense, if it's not a kind of a religion of the internet, it's maybe a slightly smaller version of a political philosophy of what's going on here. Let's start with a story that I think we've got a lot of New Yorkers here. Some of you may know this story, but I think it's a really great one. A couple of years ago, in certain neighborhoods of the city, this strange phenomenon started happening, which is that these neighborhoods like Chelsea, up by Morningside Heights, various different areas, normally along the west side, would suddenly get saturated with this very, very strong smell of maple syrup. You'd be walking along, I mean, I experienced this on a couple of occasions. You'd be walking down the street and all of a sudden it was just like breakfast was everywhere, right? And this is, in 2006, 2007, and so the city is still recovering from the experience of 9/11. Everyone's still a little bit on edge, and so there's this kind of natural response when suddenly the entire neighborhood is saturated with a strange, albeit sweet smell, that somehow this is maybe some kind of terrorist attack, right? That this the kind of Aunt Jemima wing of Al-Qaeda is making some kind of attack on us. And so the operators at the city's wonderful 311 service start getting all these calls from people saying, it smells like pancakes in Chelsea. What's going on, right? And so the city started to kind of follow this, and they initially sent out some experts with little sensors to try and figure out if the air was being poisoned in some way, and it wasn't. And so they instructed the 311 operators to say, don't worry, it's fine, just enjoy the smell and you're okay. But it kept happening, and in fact, it kept happening so frequently that the city actually created this category that the capital letters called maple syrup events that would happen, which is like some weird episode of 24 or something like that. I don't know what it is. And so they trained their kind of respondents to, when there was a maple syrup event happening, they would talk to them. And then at a certain point, someone or a group of people inside of 311 realized that these calls coming in from all these people were not just requests for information or service, they were clues. They were getting calls from specific neighborhoods. They often had specific geotags associated with that. And they would appear and then they would disappear, and they would appear and disappear in different parts of the neighborhood. And so they started keeping very accurate kind of geodata about each of the calls, and when the next maple syrup happened, they got very precise locations. And they went back and looked at past maple syrup events, and they compared, they built a map of this, and they calculated what the weather conditions were like and what the wind directions were like. And through that, they created this map that pointed with this very clear vector to the source of the maple syrup smells, which was New Jersey, of course, where all strange smells come from. No, but it turned out to be a very specific factory that manufactures, does kind of fragrance additives. And every now and then they process the fenugreek seed, which is used in many cuisines of the world. But in the US, you're most likely to find it on a supermarket shelf in maple syrup substitute, low-cost maple syrup, right? And so that's where the smell was coming from, so they could explain it. Now listen, this is a funny story. It's not a life-threatening story, but I think it embodies a lot of the values and a lot of the systems that we're celebrating and that we're interested in and that we're building on here today, right? And I love it because it showcases the kind of inherent flexibility and adaptability of a distributed network, right? The system 311 was not designed to deal with surprising olfactory events in the streets of New York, right? That's not what its purpose was. But because it was built so that other people can, across the network, anyone who can dial 3 numbers on a cell phone can contribute observations and ideas or requests or needs or complaints, it was able to kind of notice this problem and then eventually figure out the solution to the problem or solve the problem on some level. And that's the kind of structure that we find so interesting and empowering. Now, one of the things that's important here is that this wasn't really actually all that much about the internet or the web, right? A lot of the people in this room get, kind of typecast as being internet utopians, where we think that there's this caricature where there's no problem that can't be solved, by throwing the internet at it or throwing the web at it. And in fact, 311 uses some pretty advanced tech, but it really actually isn't that much about the online space. What's important about 311 is the structure of the system, right? That it deputizes the entire city, in a sense, anyone who's using the service to help track and make sense of all these events and report problems, everything from potholes to maple syrup smells. Now it occurs to me that there is a kind of politics to this that we're still trying to figure out what it really means, or we're trying to still figure out what the kind of central tenets of that politics are. And I've been thinking about this a lot because the last book that I wrote, Where Good Ideas Come From, was basically all about these kind of open innovation environments where good ideas were being developed and spread and were being built upon through these open collaborative networks. And one of the big points of that book is that while we think of the market as being a huge driver of innovation and capitalism as being the creator of all these amazing products and new ideas, if you actually go back and look at the history, an amazing number of innovations, in fact, on the long run, more good ideas that really change the world come out of non-market spaces. And the market does not have a monopoly on new good ideas that improve society by any means. So as I was promoting this book, I had this kind of funny thing happen to me where there was a wonderful series in Seattle that was run by a great woman named Kim Ricketts, who just recently passed away. And it was a series called Words and Wine. And it's a great thing for writers because you go and you get to drink wine through the entire event when you're on book tour, which all book tour events should involve. And you get interviewed by somebody. So I was in Seattle having this kind of interview with all these people, and this, everybody's drinking and everybody's having a good time, and I'm promoting good ideas and talking about this new book. And we sit down to have the interview, and the first question that I get asked, it's a joking question, but it was a telling one, is he turns to me and says, I've got one burning question to ask you, Stephen, which is, are you a communist? You write about all these open systems and the free flow of ideas and all these non-market systems. So we really want to know: are you a communist? And it was not the question I was expecting. But like a lot of good jokes, it actually had this interesting, provocative kernel of truth to it, because I don't think we really actually have a ready-made category for thinking about these political values, right? They don't fit into the traditional political maps, right? And that's what makes it so interesting to me. I mean, if you think about the parody of the right is that it believes in the market above everything else, and if you think about the parody of the left is that it believes in the state above everything else. Well, I don't think that's quite where we are, right? I mean, when we think about distributed systems, we're as far from communism as you can get, right? It's not about heavy top-down bureaucratic systems. That was the point of emergence, right? That we're about bottom-up. We're about distributed networks and the intelligence that comes from the edges, right? But it's also not just about markets, right? It's not the traditional decentralization of libertarian philosophy at the same time, right? It's all these interesting new collaborative non-market systems that don't fit into these categories very easily. Jonathan Zittrain, Yochai Benkler, Larry Lessig have talked about this in different ways. Cory Doctorow has talked about this as well. So the question is, what do we then believe in? And I have this sense that we're not in the kind of squishy middle between these two extremes, right? We're actually trying to come up with a new formula. And the simplest way that I can kind of describe that formula is that we believe, first and foremost, in the power of networks. That instead of being communist or libertarian or anarchist, our political values are network-centric or netarian. And I mean networks with a lowercase n. Building your political worldview around networks is not necessarily about technology. I mean, the internet is a particularly interesting network, but it's not the only kind. City neighborhoods, which I wrote about in Emergence, are networks too. Markets, when they work well, are networks. But I think what all these network environments share are kind of four real properties, right? They have density, so there are a lot of connected nodes. They have diversity, they have different kinds of knowledge that are kind of feeding into the system, different interests and passions, different perspectives that are all sharing information across the network. They've got some kind of feedback mechanism, some method either from above or from below for kind of promoting good ideas and demoting less valuable ones. And then they have what you could call kind of sharing and stacking. They make it very easy for good ideas to flow and circulate through the entire network, and they make it easy to build other ideas on top of those good ideas, if you can figure out new ways to kind of create platforms that allow things to be built on top of them. Those are the structures of the networks that I think we're trying to build, whether they're built out of binary code or out of kind of physical reality. And the internet has a lot of those values, which is why so many of us look at it as a kind of role model, but it doesn't actually have all of them. And for instance, it's not great on feedback in some ways. I mean, you don't have spam filters built into the internet, which is in some sense cause problems, although it also creates certain opportunities. So what does this really mean in practice? I mean, the truth is I'm still trying to figure this out. This is the project I'm working on now. So I hope that you will send me as much feedback as you can and help me think through these thoughts in public over the next few months. There are obvious ways in which that kind of Netarian approach makes sense, a lot of which have been talked about here before. Open data platforms, creating kind of app competitions to let people build interesting new projects on top of more transparent government data. That's an obvious case of kind of widening the network. When you think about arts funding, right, instead of the traditional model of big state-funded arts support or titans of industry supporting stuff in their later life as philanthropic gestures, well, our approach is Kickstarter, right? Micro-patronage, getting a network of smaller contributions to support good ideas in the creative arts. But let me give you another example drawn from the last couple of weeks of news, one that does not involve the network effects of sending a crowd shot to your Twitter followers. And this is an example, again, of a kind of low-tech thing that takes us actually, into a more serious domain, closer to Jim Gilliam's world in a sense. 2 weeks ago, Bernie Sanders introduced two bills in the Senate, the Medical Innovation Prize Fund Act and the Prize Fund for HIV/AIDS Act. So this is about as far from, iPhone apps and maple syrup events as you can get. It involves life and death issues of the high cost of pharmaceutical drugs today. And you all know the math on this. New drugs are very expensive to develop, and so we give Big Pharma these artificial monopolies on their new products so they can justify their R&D expenditures. All of which means that most new drugs are not subjected to the traditional market pressures which would otherwise keep their costs much lower. Now the Sanders bills are complicated, but in the simplest terms, they do two things. They offer billions of dollars in prize money for new pharmaceutical innovations, which will spur research from a much wider range of institutions. And they mandate that the prize winners share their innovations in an open source fashion, which means generic drug prices immediately from kind of launch day and the freedom to build on other people's discoveries. This strikes me as a perfect example of the kind of Netarian philosophy in action, right? It's not the government itself trying to come up with breakthrough drugs, which would be a disaster, or even making direct decisions about who to back for that research. And it's certainly not the same old solution of just letting the market decide and solve the problem on its own. Instead, what the Sanders bills are proposing is to use the government to widen the network involved in solving these crucial problems and making it easier to share and stack the solutions they find. Now, it's important to point out that this is not a utopian vision, right? This is not that networks are always the answer. It's just that all of the things being equal, networks are the best place to start. And I'm sure there are going to be many places as we think about these ideas where networks won't make as much sense. But I think if we begin with the premise of how do we build this kind of distributed, this kind of dense, this kind of diverse network to solve this problem, and see if we can make that work first, that is our kind of default assumption. And I should just say one last important distinction here, which is often kind of glossed over when we talk about things like collective intelligence and wisdom of crowds and things like this. This is the distinction between network intelligence and what you might call collective or aggregate intelligence, right? Collective intelligence, where lots of people are contributing small little pieces and there's some decision that's made by the entire group, can be very useful. In fact, emergence was partially about that. It's very useful in systems like PageRank, in systems like collaborative filtering, in systems like trying to guess how many marbles are in a big jar. But it's not actually what we're talking about here when we talk about the kind of political power of networks, right? When we do an Apps for America competition, we're not asking thousands of contributors to collectively build one app, right? That would be a disaster. That would be very hard to do. What we're actually asking is thousands of individuals in small groups to build thousands of individual apps and to create some feedback mechanism so we can decide what the best ones are. That is a very different distinction. So it's not in the kind of simplest way that the network itself is smart when we create these systems, in the sense of the kind of hive mind critique that you get from people like Jaron Lanier. It's that the individuals are smarter and more engaged because they're connected to the network, because they have access to the diversity of minds and individual minds and small groups that are creating and sharing all these different ideas. That's the political philosophy. It's not necessarily my religion, but it's a political philosophy that I've realized over these last kind of 8 years since that conversation in Arizona that I'm starting to believe in. And I hope that I can hear from more of you as part of this network to help me expand this over the next few months. Thank you so much for listening.